everybody. Thank you for joining us again on the Inspire Health podcast. And today we've got a beautiful conversation ahead. We are talking to John Young and Sarah Fontaine. And John Young is an expert mentor, tracker, naturalist, author of this beautiful book that Taya just put up called The Coyote's Guide to Connecting with Nature, something that our kids have been following in detail over the past year. And
No more, 3 years.
holy cow, that
Yeah.
just goes by way too fast. Yeah, for like the past 3 years. John's an author and storyteller, mentored in deep nature connection by Tom Brown Jr. and a host of elders and experts. And he's also an author of a book called What the Robin Knows. And so we're going to dive into the importance of nature and integration with nature, and as far as our emotional regulation, sensory integration. And Sarah, who's joining us as well, is an energy work practitioner, wildlife tracker, and interspecies communicator, which I would love to hear a little bit more about. For over 25 years, she has practiced a number of healing modalities, including chakra work, cranial sacral therapy, traditional Chinese medicine, and five-element theory, emotional clearing, and specifically work around polyvagal theory and somatic trauma therapy. So we're going to have a wonderful conversation and diving into all of this. So guys, thank you so much for joining us. And this series, for people that are paying attention, we are coming to the end of our series on living freely. And this has been,
And this episode, I think, is going to be a bit of a soothing balm after our last episode with Dr. Anna.
holy cow. Yeah. I think this is going to get us back to the heart of where I think actually a lot of healing takes place, and is actually an essential foundation for healing to take place, is our connection to nature. So John and Sarah, thank you so much for joining us.
Really glad to be here. Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
So I would love to hear, you guys can, however you guys want to sort of break it up here, but I would love to hear just your story a little bit. I mean, John, we came across your work through the Coyote's Guide when we were looking for alternative ways of nurturing our kids. And that's when we came across your work.
Well, I think actually it was really interesting because we're on the island, on Vancouver Island in Canada, West Coast Canada, and all the teachers with whom we randomly, not so randomly, connected with had done training with your approach with the Coyote mentoring, and we weren't even aware of it until we started to recognize how it is that they were actually moving through their day with the children within the forest, by the water, and what activities they were engaging in. And we noticed commonalities, and then we started asking questions as far as what their background was and what sort of trainings they did. And they all pointed to Coyote mentoring program. And so I started to research a little bit more about what that is and what that entails. And I came across your TED Talks video, which just won over my heart. And we'll actually put the link under this video as well for those who are interested. I highly recommend you check that out. So this episode is for parents, it's for grandparents, it's for educators, it's for caregivers. It's really for anybody who cares about our future, because essentially the way in which we tend to take care of and show up for our future generation is essentially vital in the type of future that we want to create for all of us on this planet. So we're so excited for this episode because I really feel like what you've been offering, John and Sarah as well, for the past long while, I feel like people are now really thirsty and hungry for and yearning for. And
recognizing the necessity,
the importance
for it.
of it.
I really feel like we've kind of hit a point where this is absolutely essential right now. So John, why don't we start? Can you tell us a little bit about how the Coyote mentoring platform began, and
what your background is and how you stumbled across the importance of, living this way?
Wow, that's a big question. So let's see what I can do to make this short and sweet. So I had this very, I guess, it felt normal childhood on the edge, kind of a 45 minutes, hour away from New York City. Lots of farms and orchards and woods and fields around. And my sister and I had the benefit of both my parents having parents that were alive and interested in helping raise the family. So I had a lot of time with grandparents on both sides. sometimes all of them at once, which was also really fun. Sort of the Irish ancestors on my dad's side, the Polish Lithuanian on my mother's side. But the thing they all had in common was that they all grew up on farms and they all enclaved in their culture when they first arrived in the US. So they kept a lot of their cultural spirit alive. And my grandmother on my dad's side, Cecilia McCormick Young, was an incredibly gifted mentor. So she raised us to really connect to nature. Like nature was her number one go-to. So, by the time I was 10, I've had a more than average deep connection journey with nature compared to my peers, right? That whole menagerie of animals and things that I was tending, and I was always, rehabbing wildlife and, letting it go again and raising baby birds and all that kind of stuff. And then when I did a lot of fishing as a boy, and I brought a lot of fish home for dinner from my grandmother, would encourage me and help me cook the dinner, and it just made me feel really valued. And just she was so cool at catching my stories and asking me great questions. And got to that age of 10, and all the other kids that were older than me had kind of left the woods and they were going into organized sports. And I thought, I guess I got to go into organized sports to follow all the cool kids. But I had this feeling in my body, there's something more I'm supposed to learn from nature. There's some other thing I'm supposed to do. It's supposed to be deeper. And I was longing for that next mentor. And I very synchronistically met Tom Brown on the street corner. And Tom had been raised since the age of 7 by an elder Apache who had never given up the ways of his people. In fact, when a lot of people were rounded up and put on reservations, he joined with enclaves of Apaches that kept it going, secretly. Um, and so Tom was told by his mentor, you have to find someone to pass it on the way I passed it on to you. And you'll know him by the sign he carries. So I happened to meet Tom on the street corner. I had a big giant snapping turtle, and he drove up and saw me there and asked me what I had. And I told him it was a common Eastern snapping turtle because he was a stranger to me. And he wrote to me 10 years later when I turned 21, because he was 21 when I met him. And he said that I saw a boy on a street corner, and when he told me common Eastern snapping turtle, it was only half an answer. And did I understand that the turtle represented Mother Earth? And so what he saw was a boy with Mother Earth on a string. And he said, I wonder if this is the boy that Stalking Wolf predicted that I would meet. So he kind of put me through a little bit of a test period, where he just kind of checked, what am I willing to do? What am I motivated to do? What do I know already? He really kind of interviewed me in an interesting way and decided to take me on, and he just passed away in just a few months ago. And after 53 years of being my mentor, and we kept in that relationship for those years. And he was an extraordinarily gifted mentor. And obviously, Stalking Wolf was an extraordinarily gifted mentor before him. And he was passing on what now is in that book, Coyote's Guide to Connecting with Nature. This is what Tom called coyote teaching. So he brought me on this really intense journey. That's where I learned to become a tracker. This is where I learned all the bird language. This is where I learned about all the plants and medicines and herbs and survival skills and, basketry and all the skills that come with living with the earth. And I ended up working at a school in 1978 when I graduated high school. And I was trying to imagine what I was going to be when I grew up. And I started to really think about my upbringing between my grandmothers and Tom Brown. There was a legacy of mentoring that I felt had great value that a lot of people were missing. And I wanted to make sure that I could get it out to as many people as possible. So I kind of created my own major at Rutgers University and studied indigenous cultures all over the world to see what they all had in common in their way of connecting their kids to nature. And that's how my work started. And so in 1983, I opened my first project, and I've been going ever since. And now I'm completely unemployable because the only thing I know how to do is this, how to guide people in connecting deeply with nature. So in recent years, Sarah and I teamed up to create with Nate Summers to create the Living Connection First Village, where we now have people all over the world who are learning methods to, they're all adults for the most part, so we're helping them understand how to bring this to their communities and their families. And we love it. It's kind of the best thing I've ever done.
That's wonderful. Sarah, how did you start to integrate? I mean, you started off for many years in the healing arts and a whole list of different ones that you've incorporated. And then at the same point, you've got this naturalist training under your belt as well. How did you kind of merge those two and why? What did you find the benefit of marrying those things together?
Mm. Well, I had the great fortune of having parents who loved nature and still to this day primarily look to nature for all of their forms of entertainment. And so I grew up in nature in Maine, first in a small town just northwest of Auburn, Lewiston, and then during my uh, ages like 8 to 14, I had the opportunity to live on a small island off the coast of Maine called Shebig. So long story short, spent all my time in the woods and near the ocean. So nature connection was just very natural, right? It was who I was. Like John also has that shared experience of growing up, having been completely nature connected. Um, and then moving into high school, yes, I did the sports thing. Still was super nature connected. I noticed not everybody was as interested in nature as myself. So I still had that part where I would always go to nature, but it was often very alone, especially for that deep nature connection experience where I had this intimate relationship with the forest and the ocean that most of my peers didn't share. So to get to that level of the felt sense of connection, I would often be alone. Um, and in order to have a tribe, right? Moving into college and meeting new people, where people were doing other things, there was a separation that continued to kind of occur between myself and nature. And it got to a point where I realized in my early 20s, I can't feel that feeling of connection that I know as a child, that I knew as a child, that I remember, and that I know in my being is what's real and what's healthy for me. So at that point, and I had been through trauma that had created a deepening of that separation, um, where with trauma, right, we become desensitized, right, become dissociated from our presence and our actual ability to experience the present moment. So it was those things that awareness of separation when it hit me, it even felt it made me afraid, that feeling of separation where, oh my gosh, I can't, when I actually go to the ocean, I'm not feeling that soothing that I know is available. And how do I get back there? How do I open myself back up to be able to feel that? It was really scary for me. It reminds me of like the sense of abandonment, like in an infant not having their mother anymore, that level of fear of separation. So that's why I went into the healing arts, mainly to heal myself first. Um, and and then I didn't expect actually to stay in the healing arts for more than 5 years. And 20 years later, I finally retired into this weaving with nature connection. So nature connection has always been there. And I started getting serious about practicing with that point of felt sense separation. First, I went to long distance hiking, where I hiked 5,000 miles looking for this sense of connection, right? I hiked the Pacific Crest Trail, which is 2,500 miles from Mexico to Canada through California, Oregon, Washington, and then 1,800 miles on the Continental Divide Trail through New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. And yes, those were profound experiences, but they didn't actually bring me to that place of connection in the way that I knew it was possible. And so it was then in 2014 that I had known John's work. I went to the tracker school in 2006, and so this was already part of my awareness. But in 2014, I got off the Continental Divide Trail and I committed to myself, what I really want is this communication with nature, communication with the animals, and I'm committing to the practices, which brought me into where I am now, and wildlife tracking being one of the main practices that we do and that we find is one of the most powerful in returning to that felt sense of connection.
Wow, Sarah, I feel like what you just described is kind of like the microcosm
Totally.
of the macrocosm of the entire world right now and what we're kind of moving through with regards to feeling disconnected, disassociated, moved away from, abandoned by mother and perhaps us abandoning mother, whether that be, Mother Nature or Mother Earth or a benevolent force that we have walked away or turned our backs to. Didn't it kind of seem
No,
that way to you as she
it
was
totally did. I
describing
was
her
thinking the same
personal
thing.
story?
Also, I think what was really important that you mentioned was then you immersed yourself in many ways in nature, but still had a hard time getting that connection. So I think the question, because I feel like this is a lot of people, I like, we'll even go down to the beach and I'll see a lot of people there sitting on a log, just looking at their screen or something.
And turn their back
and
away
even
on
their
the
back away
ocean.
from the ocean. So sometimes people can be in nature, but not necessarily fostering that connection that we're basically talking about. So I think probably the next question to come up would be probably two-part, and maybe you guys can go back and forth, but how do we genuinely start to facilitate this connection to nature that I think is at the heart of what we all require and we all need to heal? I mean, my honest belief is that if we are all, as a populace, if we deeply start to connect to nature, the vast majority of any of the world problems would start to shift because we would just see everything through new eyes. But how do we arrive at that? I mean, you spend, you know, I mean, I can't even imagine, but hundreds and hundreds of hours probably just in nature and still having troubles connecting in the way that you needed to. So how do we facilitate that connection, and why, from your perspective, is that so essential to have that connection?
Mention something really quickly. I remember, just briefly, I'll say this because it speaks to how a lot of us may have even forgotten the relevance of that, or how nature can even play a part with our healing. But I remember for a period in my own journey, in my own life, I was going through, and within a span of 5 years, a dark night of the soul. And I remember I just felt like what helped me most was just to go to the backyard, beyond the backyard of my parents' home, where there was a ravine, and I would just walk through that ravine over and over, and I would just lie down on the rock and just look at the clouds. And that felt the most nurturing for me at that time, and stabilizing, and regulating on my emotions and nervous system. And I remember conveying this, and I was in interior decorating at the time, and I remember conveying this to one of my colleagues, and she just looked at me blankly, and she said, "Well, how does looking at the trees or the clouds help you? Like, what does that have to do with it? Like, why don't you just go shopping and buy nice clothes?" And
Something
I
practical.
and I didn't know how to necessarily convey that, but I knew. I said, well, if you actually look at a tree, you'll be able to see so much more detail and vividness that you hadn't noticed before. And that to me was just calming. And I didn't have an answer more complicated or beyond that at the time. But yeah, how does nature play a part in our healing? And then going back to your question, I apologize if I jumped in on that, but I just thought of that story.
Yeah, no, I think that I remember you telling me that story before too. But yeah, just around how do we start the process of facilitating that deep connection that you're talking about, and why is it so essential that we do?
So first thing to remember is that when we were born with a nervous system that literally expected that nature connection would be what the culture provided. So, I see these, what I call the attributes of deep nature connection. This sort of helps you know that you've arrived because it's not really like a destination. It's not like passing a test or something like that. It's a state. It's a state change in our being. And so it's good to know what the markers are. How do I know if I am connected? Because connection is not something that our science, our social norms has looked at very much. It's starting to emerge in a lot of different fields, which is very exciting to me. But these attributes of connection are, one, we become much happier, like the happiness of a child, that innocent happiness. Two, vitality, like we have an abundance of electricity in our body. Three, we are able to listen really well to others, from a really quiet place within. And then four, we develop empathy, which is the sign that we are connected, because we really begin to feel the earth, which is something that you were referring to earlier when you expressed, Jason, that if everybody in the world got connected to nature, the world would change. I 100% agree with that. I often say that, if everybody could just do the basics, even 10 minutes here, 10 minutes there every day, the world would literally become a different place, quite literally. Because when we develop that connection and that empathy, we start to feel what's going on around us, and we start to feel responsible for it. And so that's number five. We want to take care of the people in our lives better. We want to take care of the earth better. And that's just intrinsic. It's not a mental choice. It emerges from your core. I want to help. I want to be part of the betterment of the world for the future generations. That's just natural. And then, the sixth attribute is when people become, they have reverential awe, as kind of they walk around stunned by the amazingness of this planet, and what life is so amazing. I can't even believe I get to live on this incredible planet with all these amazing things around me, all these beings and gorgeous sunsets and stars and moon. They become a life full of wonder and gratitude just spontaneously again. They then grow, the seventh attribute, they grow a capacity for compassion and love. And then the eighth attribute, which we call the keystone attribute, is the attribute of the quiet mind. So kind of like mindfulness combined with sensory integration, combined with deep sensory awareness. What that does is it stills the mental chatter and opens up this portal to what's going on within our creative zone, within our intuition. And at that point, people's genius rises. Their unique, special, who they are really comes to the surface. So these attributes are indicators, and when I work with people, I work until I see all those eight really normalized, emergent in that person, where they understand where they're coming from, how they got to them. So each of those attributes can be lifted up and exercised, sort of a little bit like occupational therapy. If you want to improve this motor function, then you do these activities. Well, if you want this attribute of vitality, you do these things in nature, and this is where it will come from, right? So there's a lot of ways to connect people to nature, and I would say that the place to start is always the place where that person wants to, right? So maybe they walk their dog and that is their avenue, or maybe they like to garden and that's their avenue. Well, maybe they feed birds or they like to bird watch. That's their avenue. So you really have to kind of meet people where they're at. That's the unfortunate part of mentoring. It's like, okay, there's no sort of one size fits all. You really have to have a wide range of tools to assess where people are at, see what they're passionate about, meet them there, and then find ways to integrate that. But the one thing which is our go-to, we always say this to everybody all the time. If you want to do this, start right outside your door. Literally, if you say, I have to get in a plane and fly to Mount Rainier National Park and go on a hike to the mountain peak in order to connect to nature, we're dead in the water, right? Because nature connection only happens, it's neuromuscular patterning, right? So how, just like the guitar hanging behind me, you don't learn it by picking it up and saying, I'm going to play the guitar. You've got to do some neuromuscular patterning, right? You got to learn how to make chords and scales and rhythm and all that. So nature connection is the same, and if practicing it means going on these adventures into nature, or in Sarah's story, hiking the whole Continental Divide Trail, right? And then realizing at the end of it that it didn't scratch the itch of nature connection. It's so ironic that nature connection is literally right outside our door. So I always tell people, get yourself a chair, put it outside your door, and maybe put some potted plants around it if you're in the city. But start there, because if you have 5 minutes here and 10 minutes there, if you take your morning tea there, if you have to be on a Zoom call and you don't have a lot to do, but your Wi-Fi reaches outside the door, sit there instead of the desk, right? Like, begin to get to know your neighbors. You referred to my TED Talk earlier in our conversation before we started here, but I described this journey that the Bushmen taught me about, which is, the first time we sit outside our door, we see a bird that comes and lands on the patio. And we're like, oh, cool, a bird landed on my patio. Well, what kind of bird? I have no idea. It's a little brown bird, right? Tomorrow, the little brown bird comes back and you're like, wow, I think that's the same little brown bird. And you kind of recognize each other. There's a thread that forms between you and that little brown bird. Well, over the course of the week, someone kind of tips you off that, oh, that little brown bird also has a dark gray head. Yeah. Oh, that's a junco. Oh, cool. What's a junco? And you look it up and you read about it. And now the thread is a string. Then you start to realize it's a male junco. And then you start to realize he's got a mate. And so now that you see them, feeding each other and preening each other, and you're like, oh, that's really special. That reminds me of how I am with my partner, and whatever. And, the cord becomes a rope over time. We develop connection slowly but surely. But once we develop that connection with this bird on our patio, that bird starts to tell us things. For instance, we're watching the bird hop do what it always does every day. We see it always doing those same things. And one day it flies up and lands on a bush and makes a noise and then flies off. And you're like, oh, I wonder if I scared it. Then a moment later, a cat comes trotting by. And then you start to say, wow, did that bird just tell me about a cat? Wow, could that be? And then you see that pattern a few times and you're like, wow, the junco can tell me when the cat is coming. I wonder what else that junco can tell us. And now you want to get to know the cat. And then you want to get to know the squirrels and the trees. And little by little, you build relationships with all the things around you. Grandfather Stalking Wolf used to say, if there was only one thing I could teach a person to get them on this journey, just one thing, and that's all I had time for, and it was only one thing, what would it be? And it is this. It's what he calls the sit area. Go to a place every day, build relationships there. And while you're building relationships, expand your senses. It's kind of that simple. But the other thing that really helps this journey is what Sarah and I are currently doing with Living Connection First Village. When you come back from having your experience in nature, your ancient nervous system that you were born with basically is telling you, it's kind of screaming at you inside like a longing. I need to tell my story to somebody. And the reason we have to tell our story, why our nervous system is asking us to, is because if we don't tell the story, the experiences don't integrate. They just kind of fly off. They leave our short-term memory and they don't become rooted in our nervous system. And so we're designed for these. Something else that came from Stalking Wolf is that there's two halves to the wheel of this. We have the experience, which is one half, where we use our senses and we build those relationships. The other half is when we come back and tell the story to somebody and integrate. And that person we tell it to, whether it's, my grandmother when I was a boy or Tom Brown when I was older, I'd tell them the story, they'd ask me good questions, and they'd send me off on another experience, right? And that's our nervous system is literally set up to respond really powerfully to that. So I'll just conclude by saying that over the years, I worked with a lot of people who were really into nature, but they didn't care for people too much. In fact, a lot of people had rough experiences with people, and that drove them into nature. So they're basically solo in nature. And I always thought, oh, these are the people who will do really well on this deep nature connection journey. But as I started to work with groups over the years, I've been at this for 40 years. I had this awakening one day when I realized, it's the people who come and bond with 2 or 3 other people that go on the journey together. They go much faster on the journey than the solo people. And it's because they share stories with each other and they share experiences and they stimulate each other's curiosity and they ask each other questions, and it causes growth, you know. And in my time spent with the San Bushmen, Sarah and I were just with them just last week. It seems crazy, but literally 10 days ago, we were with the San Bushmen in the Kalahari. You know, when you see them, this is exactly what they do. And they represent the oldest cultural lineage on the planet. They've been doing this for 200,000 years. And they never go alone into nature. They always go in twos or threes. And they catch each other's stories, and they stimulate each other's curiosity, and they join together in learning and connecting in this most profound way. And you can see this ancient nervous system just flourishing in them. And, you know, of course, if you're in their presence, it affects how you feel, and you get right in there with them. You know, it's very contagious. So, journey
That's
here.
beautiful. So it almost makes me think of the importance of, you know, interdependence as opposed to independence, which we oftentimes throw on our children and emphasize as being like one of the most important traits for them to cultivate.
Well, and it's also like the gifts that come with genuine bonds of affection that are being formed. So whether that's with the bird that then shares the gifts, or whether it's the other people that then they share the gifts, but it's like it's through that sitting and just paying attention and listening, we develop these bonds of affections, and then all of the stuff that can come from those genuine bonds of affection. It's really beautiful.
Beautiful, thank you.
Sarah, like for you, what I'd love to hear is, I mean, you spend a lot of time in things that I think most people would go, oh my gosh, that's like the epitome of nature connection, because you're right in there. What had to change? What was it for you that helped you click and make that connection reintegrate back again?
That's a really good question. And I think I'll start with the previous question and get to that place. So yeah, when John's talking about this ancient nervous system, right? It's our nervous system has evolved over millennia with nature. And the reason why we are a successful species is because of our relationships with other people, our tendency to cooperate. That is why we are human. That's why we are, you know, dominating the species list right now on the earth. So as John said, nature and other people, a sense of tribe, are our baseline expectations. And so we have to remind ourselves that currently in modern culture, many, maybe most of us are experiencing a very different sensory experience than we have evolved to, right? So there's way more people around us. There's way more artificial sounds and tactile experiences and smells and even tastes with our food. And it can feel to that part of our nervous system that's used to natural sounds and times of silence, and natural, you know, interactions and activities. It can feel abrasive, or it can feel overwhelming, or even traumatizing on many different levels of, you know, what trauma can mean. And on the, you know, one end of the scale, a minor trauma is maybe even a loud noise that makes you close down your awareness a little bit, right? So we've kind of moved into cushioning ourselves, our sensory experience, kind of numbing ourselves down, because if we are totally open when we're at work and we're working, you know, in a busy building or in traffic, or even at the grocery store, there's so much information that we actually like have to shut down our sensory awareness to a certain degree in order to function. So I completely agree with your top two. How do we get people back into nature connection as being the sit area and then the sensory experience? So talking about the sit area, like Taya, you were talking about the thing that worked the best for you was the place in your yard that you went to, right? And so that's basically what we mean by a sit area, is a place in nature where you can go and sink in, and acknowledging that reconnection takes time. So if we go to our sit area and we don't feel anything, that's actually normal. Bringing in the sensory awareness, which is a core routine that's very baseline, right there with the sit area, tuning into all of your senses in nature, listening to the birds, listening to the natural sounds of the wind, feeling the plants, feeling the bark, feeling the earth under your body, smelling the smells, and relaxing your vision to pan out on the landscape and relax into the periphery. All those practices are a way of relaxing and opening our nervous system again to receive the nourishment from nature. And again, that awareness that it takes time. So if we've been having our senses bombarded for most of our life, and then we go to try to open them in nature, it's not always automatic that you're going to feel, oh, the bliss of nature is here for me. As we are healing, we will actually release those sensory memories of why did we shut down. That memory of the really loud noise or maybe yelling is in our sensory memory. So when we start to open, we start to release those experiences, and it can actually be uncomfortable for people. And people will then say, oh, I don't want to go to my sit spot anymore. That feels really uncomfortable to be alone with myself and all of that stuff that I've been holding for so long. So I really feel like that awareness is super important. That it takes time to recalibrate our nervous system to its ancient potential, right? And to actually experience the depth of the silence in our being, right? And be able to release the noises, the static, the sensory static that we've kind of piled up around ourselves. So those two practices, along with support from people, because that experience, Taya, that you shared of your friend not or colleague not getting it, right? Like not understanding, like, okay, why? Why does that work? Like that can be, you have enough behind you or enough resourcing and an experience that you can see that, okay, well, we're in different places of understanding and experience. But as a young person, those can be devastating experiences. If you say, oh, I had this amazing, interaction with a baby fox, and somebody discounts it, right? Then you start to say, oh, people aren't safe, right? Oh, or I'm not okay to have this nature connection experience. So many people have had that, where nature isn't important, or it's weird that you connect to nature, and otherwise devalued. So when I was on the Continental Divide Trail, we're about 1,700 miles in. We're walking through the Great Basin in Wyoming, which is a daunting stretch of 130 miles through desert. There's nothing for 130 miles, which we did like 35 miles a day. So it was only like 4 days, but really long days. And so I'm like hiking alone. There's a group of 10 or 12 people that we were with, but I've gone ahead. I'm probably a mile or so ahead of everybody, just because that's how it happens, right? And I'm hiking along, and I'm suddenly seeing these big canine tracks. And I'm like, huh, those are really big canine tracks. We are not near a town. And I'm like, there's no other human footprints, because I'm ahead of everybody else, right? But there's no human footprints associated with these tracks. There's no tire tracks. This animal is got a very focused pace, and a domestic dog will kind of weave around and not have such a straightforward trajectory on their trail. So I'm like feeling it in my body. I'm like, this is a wolf. This is totally a wolf trail. And I give myself goosebumps because it was so powerful. This was my first clear wolf trail that I had been on. And I got to follow it for like a half a mile. And then it veered off the road. So we were on a dirt road that it went straight for that half mile in a very consistent pace. And then it veers off the road, and I can see the tracks going straight in that direction. And what's over there is the river. The river's 10 miles away, but I know where it is right from the map, and I can almost see the edge of the valley where it goes down. So I stop, I wait for my friends to catch up, like all filled with electricity and like wondering if they're noticing what they're walking beside. And they all pile up and they've got their earbuds in. And I'm like, look, pointing at the ground, right? And so they take their earbuds out and I'm like, check it out. And they look at me and I'm like, those are wolf tracks. And like no response whatsoever. And I go into telling them why they're wolf tracks and why they're not domestic dog tracks and thinking that they're actually interested. And like there was like barely a grunt from the crowd. Like it was like, huh, earbuds back in, continue hiking. And I was like, wow, I'm really different. And I honor that in myself, that I am so stoked about these tracks, that it is so meaningful to me. I can see the wolf, like I'm having this deep connective experience and I don't get it, right? But I was again had enough behind me that I, instead of discounting my own experience, said, I need my tribe. I need my tribe. I need to know the people that this is meaningful to. And that's what I got in 96 when so this was 2014. In 96, when I read the tracker, Tom Brown, he spoke to my child and he spoke to it so powerfully, where he has had that depth of experience that was so magical in connection with nature, that no one shared that with me at that time of my life when I was about 19 years old. And reading that book, it was like, oh, I didn't make that stuff up. Like this person actually knows about my childhood. They experienced things that I experienced. And so it opened that possibility, right? That doorway of nature is magical. I was right. I'm not alone, you know? And then it took time for me to trust that people connection. I mean, it's still a process for me to really extend out into the human realm of connection, because as with many people, a lot of our traumas have to do with relationship, right? Have to do with the people. So healing in nature first was the way that my path took me, and then moving to including the people. Again, it was honoring of time and pacing and what my nervous system could handle. And I know I'm speaking long, but I did want to get to the second question that you asked, Jason. So what made the switch for me? I got off the trail. I was adamant about learning nature, committing to wildlife tracking and animal communication. And so when I got off the trail, I had watched The Animal Communicator, which is an amazing documentary that Craig Foster made with John and Anna Breitenbach. And Anna Breitenbach is an amazing animal communicator. And in the film, it's her highlighting her amazing skill, and then it's John doing intuitive tracking. And I knew John's work. I was so interested in both of those people. I got off the trail in August. In October, I got an email that they were doing a workshop together. And I was like, wow, I can't not do that. It was in Scotland. I had no money because I was just off the trail, but I had to do it. And long story short, I was able to convince John to mentor me in tracking. He made me jump through lots of hoops. I was mentored by Josh Lane, John's apprentice, I would say, for the first part of my tracking experience. And in that is where that switch happened for me. So it was an 8-week program. Josh was mentoring me once a week, and I was to go out and find clear tracks of 27 unique mammals. And I was so into it. Like I was only working a few hours, because that's the beauty of being a body worker. You don't have to work very many hours to make your living. So I had all this time to invest, and I was super invested. And there was one moment where I was out at one of my favorite tracking places. I had found coyote tracks, rabbit tracks. I was on the creek. I was looking at what I thought was a fox den. And then I saw where a small canine, I think the fox, had been laying down. And I was doing the sense meditation, which is part of the tracking routine as well. While you're tracking, you're using your wide angle vision to take in the elements of the landscape. You're using your nose to pick up on sense on the wind. You're feeling how the wind is moving against your skin and knowing which direction the wind's coming from. Um, so I was in that place of full sensory expansion. And then when you're tracking, you're also, okay, the rabbit was there, and then the fox was over there, and then the coyote was over here. So I'm creating those threads that John was talking about earlier in the moment, all these different things. And the sun is here, and I'm smelling the ponderosa pine, and there's a squirrel alarming over here. So my threads are going in multiple directions all at once. And I had this experience of dropping into the center of it. That was so visceral. It could make me really emotional because I just stopped and I sat down and I let myself feel that feeling. Mm. Because it was that feeling that I had longed for, the feeling of being home.
Yeah, it makes me
that's
think
beautiful.
of, that's really beautiful. It makes me think of Laszlo and the spiritual experiences. Maybe you can speak a little bit of that and how he spoke of it, the importance of having spiritual
Spiritual
experiences.
experiences.
And it's that, yeah, I
It's
think,
that coming home. I think you can have however you have a spiritual experience, but I think nature is a really powerful way to have a very organic spiritual experience of coming home, however you want to interpret that.
and it's like all barriers just break down, all fall down. Any sort of construction that we had created in order to keep ourselves safe and small and protected, like all that just drops, and there's just that feeling of expansion and connection to everything that is, and that's just the
But you must have just
connection.
felt like after going through that period of feeling the separation, then all of a sudden it just felt like you just got welcomed back into this loving embrace, back home. All of the things that you felt were missing there that you came back to. So that's really beautiful. I love those stories.
And all the things that, Sarah, that I feel like we're all yearning for, and I feel like we're all being called home too. And it's this feeling of when we look around at the world around us and we go about to 9 to 5 jobs, or we're in a rush to get our kids to school and cook a meal and then put them to bed and start the rat race all over again the next day. At the end of the day, I feel like a lot of people are like feeling that sense of void, that disconnection, that numbness, because they internally, on a deep level, we feel that something's amiss, something is not aligning as it should be. There is something that is calling us home, but maybe because we don't know what that is based on our programming or what we were told success or fulfillment is, and we keep chasing it, and it's not that, but we're being called to something even greater and greater, and I feel like that's happening more and more these days.
For sure. And I think then what we end up doing is, because nature's been discredited and people have actually been moved more apart from it than together to it, then we misplace looking for something else to kind of create that togetherness, that wholeness that you found in nature. We keep outsourcing it to something else, hoping that we're going to find it. But at the end of the day, I think it comes back, like I said it earlier, John, too, just if people were able to spend time to touch something like that. I mean, this must come in with the self-knowledge. This is what's different with self-knowledge versus like mental information. You have a visceral feeling and you can't change that. You bring it back and you feel it again, like instantaneously, right?
And I actually have this open to a page here, Coyote's Guide, which I was reviewing prior to our interview, you know, you follow up a paragraph, a long paragraph, group of paragraphs under learning to listen by then speaking of self-knowledge. John, can you speak a little bit about that? Like, how does learning to listen deeply, what does that have anything to do with knowing who we are, what we are, and why we're here? Essentially, the self-knowledge.
I think listening is probably the key to that. But there's different kinds of listening, right? You know, there's different consciousness centers that we all move back and forth between, right? Like our thinking mind, our, you know, rational mind, it's reasoning and thinking about stuff. There's kind of our emotional sense, what our heart is feeling, as some would say. Then there's what the body is saying. And the body is the quietest of all of them. And if we are forever trapped in our mental process, if we're forever, you know, I remember teaching high school kids about the sense meditation and quieting their mind. And this one kid actually got scared because he's like, well, if I'm not thinking, I must be dead. And I said, well, wait, hold on. You know, give me a thought, you know, tell it to me like a sentence. So he tells me a thought. He just had random thought. And I said, okay, so where were you between those words? Were you dead? You know, because it wasn't a continuous stream. There was, you know, thought nuggets that were strung together in sentences in your mind. I said, but in between them, were you dead? He's like, oh, no, you're right. So anyway, I mean, there's some people who are just so attached to that consciousness, they cannot escape it. And if you're one of those people, then you can't hear your body talking to you. So when we practice, you know, what Sarah was calling the sense meditation earlier, you know, using your ears to listen to the quietest sound and the direct, you know, I like to say, just listen as far out to the right as you can right now. Listen as far out to the left. Now try to do them both simultaneously. Now listen out in front of you, listen behind you. And what you're aiming to do, one of these people I've been training and is now a colleague. I've been working with her for 20 something years. She expressed it this way. She was talking about this journey of the sense meditation. And she was saying, I remember when John told me to listen far off to the right, far off to the left, far out in front of me, far out behind me. I didn't think I could do all four at the same time in the beginning, but I kept going to my sit area every day and I kept trying. And eventually what happened, and I kind of didn't notice it, but over the weeks and months, I suddenly realized that it all merged into a spherical soundscape that I was able to tune into all at once. And, you know, that's what we're going for. You know, it's like our brain is capable of this. No problem. It's what we're born to do. So when we do that, and then we feel the wind and we smell the smells and we feel our body walking and we're using our peripheral vision, or what Tom Brown called wide angle vision. We're moving in a smooth way across the landscape and we're responding to the animals. You know, if a bird flies up over here, we stop and look for a second to see if we're causing that disturbance. If we are, we just sit quiet for a minute and the bird goes back to feeding. Then we start to move. So we get into this conversation with the landscape, right? The mind can't think and navigate that at the same time. It brings us into this profound inner silence, which is what we call the quiet mind. Well, the stronger the quiet mind gets, the more it can hear the consciousness of the body, the thoughts of the body, if you will, the voice of the body, however we want to describe that. And perfect example of this would be, I'm walking. Now, I'm allergic to yellow jackets. If I get stung by yellow jackets, it could be the end of me, quite literally, right? So I have to be really, especially now, this time of year in California, there's so many yellow jackets around. So when I'm walking, and maybe I'm looking at some coyote tracks and I'm following them, so I'm kind of interested in where's the coyote going. So I'm going to be kind of not necessarily focused lock. I want to vary my vision. I want to go from the coyote tracks back out to that wide angle vision. Following the coyote, I'm not thinking about yellow jackets. All of a sudden, my body stops. Now, I didn't tell it to stop, but my mind was quiet enough where my body stopped, and I recognized that my body stopped, and I didn't tell it to. So it makes you wonder in those moments, who's actually driving this thing? I thought it was my body. I got up this morning and put clothes on it. It should be listening to me. You know what I mean? I didn't tell you to stop, body. Why did you stop? And I'm always amazed that my body will stop without my instruction. Every single time that happens, it's something that I need to pay attention to every time. So in this case, I stop. I'm like, why did I stop this time? So I go into wide angle vision, I stand still for a minute, and in my peripheral vision, I see the movement of these yellow jackets coming and going from a hole in the ground. And it was right ahead on my path. Had I been busy in my head and just plunging along, following that coyote and just being totally focused blocked, I would have stepped right there and I would have been stung 100 times and I might have died. Sometimes your body stops and your head just turns to the right for no reason. You didn't tell your head to turn to the right, but your eyes don't just randomly look around to the right. Your eyes lock perfectly with the deer that was hiding in the shadow of that bush. Your body stopped and you immediately felt the deer looking at you and you looked right into its eyes. This is what listening is. It's like an integration of all your consciousness, your mind, your heart, your spirit, your soul, your body, as one of my elders used to say. This is when you're in your greatest power. And I don't mean that power of authority or, power of domination. I mean, the power of connection, deep connection, which to me is the most beautiful power there is.
Beautiful. Thank you. I feel like that's definitely being missed nowadays, where we think we are constantly chasing for the next gadget or the most updated device, whereas we're missing the fact that our greatest and most powerful technology is the body. And we just haven't yet perhaps learned to harness its full capacities and capabilities, but the powers that are putting together these devices, they're essentially getting the inspiration
From nature.
and from nature, from our own bodies, from our own capabilities and capacities.
John, I know you've got a hard stop at in about 10 minutes here. So one thing I would like to discuss for a little bit with you guys is the idea of sensory integration and emotional regulation. You spoke about this in your TED Talk, but I feel like this is really, really profound, particularly now. I know, in the world when we look at things with kids, it's so many kids get diagnosed as being on an autistic spectrum disorder and sensory integration and ADHD and all of the different labels that they get sort of hit with. Where does the nature integration, the listening, how does that work with our ability to sensory integrate? And then how does that affect how we actually feel and able to interact in the world? I know that's a big one, but maybe we can pass it back and forth to the two of you to unpack that a little bit.
All right, well, let's look at sensory integration. Reflect back on something that Sarah was sharing earlier about the little traumas our senses experience, the loud noises, car sounds, loud motorcycles going by, horns beeping, voices that aren't in conversation with us, lights blinking, flashing, all this kind of stuff. So it doesn't necessarily make sense in our ancient nervous system. So I like to think about, when I'm talking about sensory integration, we may be watching a video on our device, like maybe it's a video game, right? And then there's a soundtrack on the video game that might be music, but it doesn't necessarily go with what we're watching. I mean, the producers and the artists who create it, they try to make it match. They, give it a theme, but it's very different than what our ears and eyes are designed to do together, right? So when people first start awakening their senses, Sarah was talking about how sometimes it takes a while because there's like, maybe it's not safe for me to open my senses. But when we take people on that awakening the senses journey, in the beginning, they may not be able to pinpoint sound accurately in three-dimensional space. I'll be running a bird language workshop for beginners for the public, for instance, and we might have 50 people in the we tend to do them outdoors, so we come together under a marquee They just get out of the sun or the rain. And they're all sitting on the ground or they're sitting in their chairs. And I'm in the front of the room and I say to them, okay, everyone close your eyes. And they all close their eyes. And then, I picked the first and loudest bird sound that's convenient. So a raven flies over and makes a call. I say, okay, keep your eyes closed. Everyone point to where that raven just called. And their hands are pointing all over the place. It literally looks like a pincushion or a porcupine. Okay, so I asked them, okay, at this point, I want you to open your eyes, but don't move your hand. And I want you to look around the room. Don't move your hand. One of you may be right, but you can't all be right. What does that say about our ability to pinpoint sound in three-dimensional space? So there's no calibration yet in that realm, right? Tom Brown worked on this with me early. I got to the point where I could pinpoint sound in three-dimensional space, but it probably took me 2 years. I know that sounds crazy because everyone probably thinks they can do it. But when you're in the forest and you're surrounded by trees and bushes and wind and leaves and sounds, it's so interesting that people point differently at the sound. But what happens is one day you hear a jay making an alarm. You see the jay with its beak pointed towards the ground and it's bobbing its head up and down with each vocalization. Now the sound matches what you're seeing. That's integration of those two senses. But even more so, as you learn to listen to your body, you actually feel your diaphragm, that part of your body, which we call, that core area, twitching with every sound. Like you're getting a visceral response in your body. So now your eyes, your ears, and your gut are integrating. Now that's communication. When you ask yourself, what do I feel when I tune into that feeling in my gut? I suddenly feel anxious. Now the question is, well, I wasn't anxious. I was enjoying my day in nature. I felt really good. But I suddenly feel anxious where a minute ago I didn't. And then you go investigate what the bird is yelling about, and you see a bobcat hiding there. So the anxiousness was in the air. It wasn't your anxiousness. This is the journey of sensory integration. The winds play into that, the smells play into that, the humidity, the sun, the wind, because they all tell one story. And it takes a while for our senses to begin to trust to work together again, because now the sounds match the sights, match the feelings, match the scent, match the wind direction. All that stuff starts to come together, telling a coherent story. Our nervous system loves that coherence. It loves that. And there's another side to this journey. When you go deep enough on this journey, you start to develop that coherence, that sensory integration. It's really hard to go back into the lights of the city or into the shopping mall. All of a sudden, it's like, whoa, so you have to actually learn to mute your senses by will. Do you know what I mean? Like, you don't want them to be always shut down as a default. You want to be able to experience things fully, but you want to also know how to turn off the valve when you need to, right? So you learn that as a strategy for living in modern times, because you're going to go from these beautiful, gorgeous spiritual experiences like Sarah described back into a loud, disintegrated world. And you have to get used to going fully back and forth between these two worlds and navigate it in a good way.
I think that's a beautiful way to even speak of the children and the diagnoses, and because how much of it has to do with them. I mean, in a culture where we like to isolate things and keep things separate, like, if there's a knee issue and you go see a specialist, they'll say, well, go see a surgeon for, get an MRI or do ultrasound, just looking at the knee as an isolated thing, apart from all the other body parts that are connected and have a part to play. And in a similar way, when we're talking about our children, our children then get isolated and taken in and examined and done tests upon, whereas could we be looking at the whole? Could we be looking at the structures and the environment within the home, the dynamics between the parents or the parent, or the society at large, or the media that comes into play within that household? I mean, there's so many different pieces that are that actually affect our children's health.
Well, and even when you're talking about, you said the anxiousness was in the air and then we became aware of it. I mean, gosh, how much anxiousness is in the air now on a regular basis
On a collective level.
that people are exposed to. And again, I find a lot of times people, they take it on as their own, and a lot of times, some of it can be their own, but it's just this melting pot of emotions that I feel like people are exposed to, and often without knowing how to even separate it out a little bit. And when we're in environments that are not out in nature, it can be really difficult. I think when you're in a city, I know, just we live outside more in rural, in nature, and even going into the city, it feels very different. You almost feel like you hit a density when you start to go into it, and you kind of naturally start to just have little bits of guards around, or in some ways I feel like I'm oversensitive to certain things, almost to certain things, and on other ways of like lights and sounds, it's like you're trying to dampen back down. So yeah, it can be a lot to try to integrate.
I do want to throw this one piece in there because there's no sensory integration and emotional regulation are so interlinked, right? So Sarah and I decided that we would practice wide angle vision and that gliding walk and use our listening skills in our body. We went into a big box store and we separated from each other, and then we just actually tried to find each other just using body radar, as we say, like where do I feel Sarah now? So now we play that game all the time. So it actually makes these things that used to be highly, like, we used to leave those stores going like, oh my God, I'm so exhausted. Now we leave with this big smile on our face, like laughing, like so we can actually be playful in these things too. The more awareness we have of it, the better.
I love that. That kind of totally recontextualizes the experience. So
Very good.
awesome. Sarah, I know we're down towards the end here, but Sarah, I'd love to get your feedback even from your work with polyvagal theory and somatic trauma therapy, as far as that kind of tying back in with the sensory regulation and emotional piece of it that you've found.
Yeah, what I think is really important is that the more time we spend in a regulated state or a peaceful state, the more resilience we build. So we can actually retrain our nervous system toward a positive bias, or a bias of toward peaceful feelings, toward stability, where many of us are actually biased toward stress responses, toward anxiety. So our nervous system actually, we myelinate the sheaths of our neuronal pathways with what we do the most. So if we're spending a lot of time anxious or stressed, we will have a tendency to have that response. But we can create the choice to practice, actually intend, have the intention, I'm going to go to nature to find that deep sense of peace within myself, to allow my nervous system, my sensory experience to connect in peaceful feelings of relaxation in my body, so that over time, right, you then have the ability to, instead of reacting, you have capacity to choose a response, right? Instead of going to the grocery store and just feeling like raw and open and reactive to things, it's like, no, I can remember that feeling in my being of being in my sit area or being by the ocean. And it becomes the more familiar place to be, right? The more familiar place in your body of how you're moving through the world and how you're responding to the world. And I love playing scout games in grocery stores with John. So there's that tribe again, right? So having another person, an ally, like, we don't like to go to town alone. We do, and we're okay. But it's so cool to go together, because then we're holding this intention to be like the peacemakers in the grocery store or in the parking lot, right? And we're tuning into the guy behind the meat counter who's he's also, looking for a smile or a sense of warmth, right? So you start to notice those, our allies, right? The more that we're tuned into looking for peace, or in polyvagal terms, we look for cues of safety or we look for cues of threat. That's how our nervous system is wired. So if we're biased toward assuming there's a threat, like the grocery store is always stressful, that's what your nervous system is going to pick up. That's what you're going to feel. And if we can step back, acknowledge with our cognitive mind, okay, the grocery store isn't a threat typically, right? I can be safe at the grocery store. We literally have to connect our cognitive, our intellectual understanding to our body's mind, right? And like tell your body the grocery store it's okay. You can be safe here. And I know that sounds elemental or it sounds childlike, but really it's that listening and communication with the quiet mind of our body. Our body is at a different level of attunement, of awareness, and to bridge that gap through they talk about the top down integration. This would be top down integration, where I'm using my cognitive intelligence to inform my body. Okay, I'm taking a deep breath. Body, it's okay to relax. And then I'm being, bottom up aware of, okay, body, I feel you're anxious. Okay, I'm listening to you. Is there threat around? No, I assess there's no threat. So we're now in communication, and your body can start to trust that your mind's going to take care of it, because your body's like, oh, you're actually listening to me. Right? So it's creating that bridge where there's often so much separation, where your body's like, no, there's danger. No, there's danger. Right? There's a loud noise over there. There's a stressful person. I can feel them next to me. Yeah. So building those bridges between ourselves. And again, I just want to honor time and having patience with ourselves. And when we talk about emotional regulation, like there's that place of allowing emotion. Emotion is natural, right? And really understanding that our emotion is an experience of the body and of the heart and of the mind. So it's not a small thing to regulate emotion. And then to really ask, what does that mean? It doesn't mean not having emotion. It means really normalizing emotion. Like, wow, the world's in a hard place. Like there's a lot to feel. There's a lot to feel. And so again, when we talk about emotional regulation, co-regulation is such an important piece of that. We're not meant to go alone as humans. We're meant to be in tribe. So having another person that you can share your feelings with, we literally share a nervous system with other people. So what's happening in the world is too much for one person to integrate. We really need to be with other people in the experience and be able to express ourselves, express what use our words, the linear aspect of our mind to express what we're feeling. So that's part of integrating the hemispheres of the brain, being able to tell our story and be heard, as we are also feeling what we're feeling. But I want to reflect on nature here, right? So again, many of us don't necessarily feel safe with other people, especially if we're going to share our emotions. So I had the opportunity to ask Stephen Porges, who developed polyvagal theory, can we co-regulate with nature? And this is a question that I'm holding and unfolding, just out of my own, deep curiosity. And he said, there's not enough science done that points to it or proves it out, but there is a lot of evidence, right? So he has done studies on going to the ocean and our body responding to the wave, like motion, well, the waves, and our body responding to the waves and mirroring that wave-like motion that is soothing to our nervous system. And there's other research done by his wife, who studies oxytocin. I can't remember her name right now. Anyway, she studies oxytocin, and oxytocin is a result in our human body of co-regulation with other people, but it's also a result of being in nature. So if the result of co-regulation, we talk about co-regulation with other people, if the result is serotonin and oxytocin, then there is this bridge with nature. And I think a lot of people experience that when I go to my place in nature. The forest is a place for me where I feel that sense of I'm actually in relationship, where I feel like I'm being co-regulated. I feel like the presence of nature is holding a space for me that's allowing me to not take it all on, to be with another that's actually not human, right? So I find this is a really cool piece of future scientific research that someone's going to take on. I'm doing it in my own kind of self research, self study, and piecing together other people's research. But I do believe that we co-regulate with nature, and that it is a safer place for a lot of people to start out the healing process.
There's a wonderful book called Your Brain on Nature, which goes through a lot of that type of information around. There was a colleague of mine back in naturopathic medicine that wrote that, Alan Logan. But it's a great book that breaks down all of the chemical changes in nature. Guys, we are wrap it up here, but wonderful. We're going to bring you guys back for our next series that will be specifically around kids and children and educating, supporting our kids. It's going to be awesome.
Any final closing statements you wish to share, John? I mean, this series that you guys are a part of is called Living Freely. And I don't know if there's any closing thoughts you wish to share on nature and how we can reconnect with nature in order to live more freely in our bodies and our societies.
To me, when I hear thinking of living freely, I don't think we can live fully freely unless we have our ancient nervous system. I honestly don't. I really feel like some of the freest people I've met are the most deeply earth connected people. And they haven't all been indigenous by birth. There's many people like Tom Brown, for instance, who, was raised in a family in New Jersey, in a suburban neighborhood, but had this deep spiritual freedom because of his deep connection with the earth and with it and all of that, what we've been talking about. I think we are our best when we are deeply connected into the potential of our ancient nervous system. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Both of you.
Thank you guys very much. Where can people learn more about the work that you guys are doing?
www.livingconnectionfirst.net. That's our landing page. We have lots of different offerings there.
Okay, wonderful. And I highly recommend that people also sign up to your newsletter, because I've been getting them these last 2 times that you guys have sent them out, and they're wonderful and full of information there as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, guys.